Good evening, good evening. Welcome, everyone. We are live. I have a special guest with me today, Miss Shamika Williams. We are
Hello.
talking about grief awareness. Hey, Miss Shamika, how are you, beautiful?
I'm doing good. Sorry, I had to take myself off mute. I'm
Oh,
doing
that's
well.
okay.
Thank
That's
you for the
okay. How are
invite. I'm
you?
so excited to be here.
Me
I'm good.
too. You know, we had an amazing meeting last week, and we're gonna talk to it about that. We're gonna talk to the people about that. I want to
Yes.
make sure that we are live, guys. If you see us live on Facebook, please share the live because we want as many women as possible and men, whomever needs this, actually to see today's show. We're actually live in the Women's Wellness Lounge right now, so I'm going to share that on my personal page as well so that we
Share
can
this. Right.
boost up the participation. Y'all know how I am. Y'all know my energy. Y'all know I love in live participation. So
Mm-hmm.
let me share the post right now onto my own personal page.
Same. I'm doing this.
Okay.
Yep.
See if
Good.
it'll let me share it on yours too.
Mine should be okay. I think I just shared it.
You shared it? Boom.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's all we need. All right. Yep. We are live. Okay, back to the business. All right. So today, National Grief Awareness Day. And
Yeah.
I basically just said that we want to talk about the importance of properly addressing and processing grief. Now, the one big disclaimer that we're going to put out here right now, right here, Shamika, is what? Grief does not necessarily mean death.
Nope.
So talk to the people about what that means because I think that the majority, and I won't say everyone,
Yeah.
but the majority of folks, when you hear the word grief, we automatically associate that with death.
Yeah.
So drop some nuggets to us right here, right now, out the gate before we even get started, that what grief can be, what it looks like, what can precipitate grief.
Yeah, so grief really is any type of loss or transition, right? So a lot of times when we talk about grief, grief is, people say, oh, somebody died, but
Mhm.
grief can happen. It is not exclusive to death, right? And so that means that grief is I lost a friend. Grief is I'm going through a divorce. Grief is I lost a job. Grief is I lost anything. Anything that you lose and you have to transition and try to figure out a new way of life, um, that's grief. And so a lot of times we get caught up in the death part of it. But anytime you have to transition from one part of your life to another, you're going to experience some type of grief. And so any type of loss and grief really is extreme sadness. And the dictionary may say death, but really it's at loss, right? Because we lose all the time. Even when we lose ourselves often. And so, because of that, I would say that grief is sadness about any type of loss that you have experienced. And so, I like to make sure that people are clear about that.
Yep, yep. And it's two words. That's the association that I want them to make is loss. And so again, when we talk about loss, it can be you losing yourself, right? Which we all at some point can obviously associate with. It can doesn't necessarily have to be the loss of a person. It could be loss of a job, loss of a relationship, right? So and transitioning. So we found out even last week when we were doing our good grief support group that we did have some people in there. Yes, they did have loss of loved ones, some loss of job,
Yep,
transitioning, loss
yep,
of themselves
yep,
through feeling like they had to show up for everyone all the time, everywhere. And then sometimes throughout that, we lose our identity, we lose our voice,
yep,
we lose ourselves. So
yep.
that also can precipitate grief as well. So
Absolutely.
yeah, grief is loss. Doesn't necessarily have to be a person. So with that disclaimer out there, now that everybody on the same page, now we know what grief is all about.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the importance of addressing grief. That's my other like soapbox that I can get on when we talk about that processing, like, and not just addressing it, right? And process. It's the proper way, because you can address something, you can process it, but are you
Mhm.
addressing it and processing it properly? That's the key. So
Yeah.
talk to us about that, like what that looks like, and I guess the pros and the cons about that. Meaning, what does it look like when you properly address and process grief, and then what does it look like when you don't?
Right, right. So I think that a lot of times when we experience any type of loss, what happens is we are looking for ways to hide the pain or not feel the pain. And so, because of that, what then happens is a lot of times in our society, we use drugs, we use sex, we use alcohol, we use anything that's going to temporarily stop that pain. So, that's not a positive way to grieve, right? Because what happens is that's never going to take away how you really feel, right? It's just going to cover it up for a moment, but it's not going to take it away. And so that is a negative way to grieve. And another negative way to grieve is trying to put people in positions um, because you have a hole or you have a loss there, right? I know that when my mom passed away, I was trying to fill the hole from when she passed away with other people or with things, right? So I started obsessing about clothes. I started obsessing about specific people, and that was because I was trying to fill that hole. But you will never fill those holes. And even in times in my life when I lost myself, right? Negatively, I was trying to do things, or I try to be around people because I felt like that was going to help me feel better, but it didn't, right? And so all of these things are temporary. The things that are permanent and that are more positive is number one, going to a therapist. I know that therapy is not for everybody. So coaching, right? So I'm a grief coach. So for me, coaching is a little bit different just because I'm with you day to day, right? We talk all the time so that I can hold you accountable. And for some people during the grieving process, they need that. Journaling. If you had, are you religious? If you have a higher power, tuning into that, processing your grief, finding out how you feel, why you feel, and just being able to sit in how you feel, right? So grieving is not easy. And I really hate when people say, "Oh, well, in a while, you'll get over it." You will never get over it. I just want to explain that to people. Grief is not something you get over, it's something you get through, right? So getting over grief is not something that is safe. It's also something that's not it's not real. That's not real life, right? And so I need people to understand that it is not something that you get over. It is something that you go through, and
Right.
you have to go through it. And I actually have a shirt that says "Grief can't wait,"
I
right? Because it
like
can't wait.
that.
Yeah, because the longer that
Mhm.
you wait, grief will wait for you.
Yeah.
And that's why I was talking about
Yep.
temporary coping mechanisms.
Mhm.
It will still
Mhm.
wait. It
Right.
because you can do all those things and it will still wait for
And
you.
it'll still be there when you get
Still
done,
be
right?
there.
Like you said, at the end of
Absolutely.
whatever, buying that bag, shot, that
Yep.
retail therapy or
Exactly.
drinking or smoking or sex,
Yep.
whatever. At the end of all of that, that grief will be
Yep.
still sitting there looking at you
Still
like,
there.
what? I'm right here. Whenever you're ready to process me, I
Exactly.
am here, right?
Exactly.
So I have on the screen a couple of things that you shared of ways that you can begin to properly address and process that grief, and that's
Mhm.
coaching, journaling, and therapy. It's not in any specific order. I
Yeah.
was just kind of note taking those
Absolutely.
things as you were saying them.
Mhm.
So, if you are joining us live, again, coaching, journaling, therapy, take note of it, screenshot it, whatever you need to do. But those are some ways in which you can that can assist you with that, with properly assessing.
And I also would say finding something that you love to do, right?
Yeah.
I feel like for me, I found makeup, right? That was something that I love to do,
Hmm.
right? But
Hmm.
at the end of the day, it was something that allowed me to process my grief in a more positive way instead of
Right.
finding something that was more destructive, right?
Yeah.
Because for me,
Hmm.
I was extremely destructive in some of the behaviors that I displayed. But when I found out that they weren't going to help me and they really weren't going to allow me to grieve the way I needed to, I had to find something else.
Yeah.
And, so I had to find things that actually made me happy and fulfilled.
Yeah. Mine was, I put your quote up there. It was grief won't wait, right?
Yep.
Okay, so I put that up there. You guys screenshot that, make note of it.
Mhm.
as well. Grief won't wait.
Mhm.
For me, it was DIY. I became like this
Yeah.
obsessed with like doing DIY. It was something
Yeah.
about sitting down, like doing things with my hand
Yeah.
and just like processing that. That helped me through the grief and loss of my mom. I took over our spare bedroom with DIY stuff.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
husband was like, "What is all of this? What is you got going
Mhm.
on? Like, what are we doing, girl?" I had
Mhm.
epoxy, glue, bling, this,
Yeah.
that, and it
Resin,
was
everything.
just, yeah, it was
Yeah.
just, it took over, but it helped me because it allowed me to sit still and to process my own way,
Yeah.
what I needed to really just kind of keep still. So
Yeah.
that was my thing. Yeah, I did
Yeah,
that.
definitely. Definitely.
Yep.
And I get that. I think that a lot of times we do have to find something that um will make us happy, but also we also got to understand that as much as we want to move, because when
Hmm.
we lose, we tend to want to keep busy, and
Absolutely.
sometimes it's going to be very important that we sit still.
Oh, for sure.
And
If not, grief will smack you and make you sit still,
oh,
right?
they'll be like, oh, "Okay, no
Yeah.
worries,
Okay,
I got you.
you want to keep dutching and dodging,
Like,
and you
you
know,
know, you can't
thinking,
avoid me."
no, you can't
Yes.
avoid me. Like you said, it's not something that you get over. You
Yep.
go
So
through
you
it, so
get
you
through
can do.
exactly.
You can do
And
what
so
you
yeah,
want.
you do have to sit still sometimes and actually listen to yourself and process your own feelings, because
Yep.
otherwise you're hearing what the world is saying about your grief and you're not hearing what you're saying about
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. Yep.
it. Yeah.
So again, thank you guys for joining us. I want to see who has joined us live in here. We've got Christina. Christina, thank you for joining us. Welcome, welcome,
Yay.
welcome. We are
Thank
talking
you.
about National Grief Awareness Day, and we're
Yeah.
talking about properly addressing and processing grief. So thank you for Christina for joining us. We got Chanelly Nell joining us. Hey, hey,
Hey,
thank you for joining
Chanel.
us live. And so Christina said, "Yep, grief waits until you process it." So true. So Christina, you know what I'm getting ready to move into next, and that is how grief will show up in other ways. And I'm
Mhm.
talking about physically, right? Not
Yeah.
just the emotional processing of it.
Yeah.
But for me, in particular, when I wrote about my grief, a lot of us, and we talked about this, Shamika, as well, just briefly, we talked about it on last week, that emotional eating, because we're not processing our grief.
Yep.
I threw what was healthy eating out the window. You know what I wanted? I wanted comfort food. I wanted stuff that made me feel good. I
Yep.
wanted just with every single chew, every single bite, swallowing it, go down, yummy, yummy, get in my tummy, make
Yes.
me feel good, right?
Yes.
And so it can show up in other ways based on obviously the habits that we um, acquire, but
Yeah.
also unprocessed grief can show up in cardiovascular ways because it will stress you out because
Yeah.
just like anything else, it's festering in there and you're not dealing with it.
Yeah.
So, other than that, what are some other things that kind of come to your mind, Shamika, when you think about us suppressing grief and having it show up in other ways?
Yeah, so I think what you said was important. I think a lot of people go through weight changes
Hmm.
uh, from emotional eating or not eating when they
Hmm.
lose, right? And part of that is because there's a level of stress. Our stress hormone is then activated, right?
Yep.
And we're not active. One of the things that happens is that we tend not to be active at all, because we don't want to leave the house. You know, we're depressed. And I've had, even in my own body, my weight was pretty steady, but once I had a major loss, I was yo-yoing. You know, you try different diets and you do these different things, and I think that until you really deal with the root of the problem, it's not gonna,
Right.
it's not gonna heal itself.
Absolutely.
And it's so important because when you're stressed and when you're that grief is sitting in
Mhm.
your heart, it literally will sit there until you begin to peel back the layers of it, right? And I think
Absolutely.
also we have to remember that our body reacts to our mental status, right?
Mhm.
And so a
Mhm.
lot of times I've seen where people have got diseases and viruses and infections because they
Oh,
are
absolutely. Yes. Yep.
dealing with just the breakdown of how grief has affected their entire body.
Mhm.
And the more you let it sit, the longer that you are causing destruction to your body.
Exactly.
And so
Yep.
I think that people don't realize how grief then affects your physical body just by not addressing it in your mental health.
Absolutely. Yep. And they are interconnected. I always tell people
Yep.
all the time they are
Absolutely.
very much interconnected. Um,
Absolutely.
because if you don't process that grief again emotionally, mentally, how
Mhm.
can you really muster up, if you will, the energy to want to go out and socialize or work out or even eat properly? I
Yep.
kind of went through this whole roller coaster thing. There was a period of time, especially immediately after my mom passed, I was not eating anything. I think I was drinking more than any drinking water, not alcohol.
Mhm.
Drinking, like I would drink a smoothie or have, water, but physically eating,
Yeah.
I didn't. Then once I realized like it hit me, it was like, I don't know what it was. It was just, it actually hit me. Again, you go through those stages that my mother really was gone and she was not coming back and I couldn't pick up the phone and call her like I would normally do. From there, I went immediately into what I just described, which was eating all the wrong things, like, wanting to feel good, to feel that void, because I had actually realized that she was not there and was not,
Yeah.
coming back. It was just, it's funny how the mind works when you're not processing things, or even when you are properly processing what it will go through to try to protect you
Yeah. And
in certain
I
situations.
think in that also, when we think about us as, especially with adults, right? So once we have had a major loss, whether it's for ourselves, a job, a breakup, whatever it is, what then happens is we still have to be adults. So we
Hmm.
still have to pay our bills. We still got to go to work. We still have to do this. And what happens is then eventually we experience another loss, right? So
Yeah,
then it becomes complicated grief, is what they call it, because now
right,
we have layered things on top of it. And so I know a lot of times we want to wait to deal with our grief, but what happens is the longer you wait, the more susceptible you are for something to be laid on top of it.
right,
And so
exactly.
that's why it's so important that we kind of work through and learn. And it's something that you literally have to learn how to
Mhm.
deal with loss, how to deal with transition. Because if you don't, what happens is when it will continue to happen.
Mhm.
Life's every
Life,
day.
right. We said that before. Life will life.
Life will life.
Life will life.
So you got to kind of figure out a way for you how you process it, because as the losses come, you can kind of figure out how you need to process it for
Mhm,
you so that it doesn't become so complicated and harder to pull you. Because the more complicated it gets, the more you layer on top of it, the
mhm.
harder it is to sift through.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. Like with anything, like you said, complicated. And I find that people that I encounter that don't deal with grief or don't properly address it again, as we said, and
Mhm.
process it, they begin to compartmentalize. And that is becomes like the coping mechanism for them,
Yeah.
right? It's to compartmentalize. It's still
Yeah.
there, but I'm not dealing with it right now. Let me box it up, put it over here. Let me, box this up, put this over there. And then what happens is, what I typically find is another incident or life-changing event will happen, and then it's all compounded because you never dealt with
Yep.
that issue, right? And so
Exactly.
therefore everything else that you've compartmentalized and boxed up, suddenly you've got them all just
Everything.
kind of like coming at you. I'm feeling a certain way. So talk to us a little bit about that, before I kind of transition into the next part of what I want to talk about. But talk about what I guess what the dangers are really of compartmentalizing and kind of what that looks like, because I think you touched on it a little bit when you said the complicated grief, but talk a little bit about that and what that looks like for people and kind of what the dangers of not properly again, processing and compartmentalizing.
Absolutely. So I think the first thing that you said was when you don't deal with grief, it'll deal with you, right?
Mhm,
And so I always tell people, like, you cannot deal with it, but it's going to deal with you. Even subconsciously, it deals with you,
right.
right? And so there are then actions that come out that you probably don't, a lot of people don't even realize that
Mhm.
are coming out, but they're coming out because you haven't dealt with the things that you have now put in compartments,
Yeah.
right? So the danger is
Mhm.
in that is oftentimes you then have outward actions for
Mhm.
inward emotions, right?
Ooh.
And so, because you have outward actions for inward
Mhm.
emotions, you can't even see that these things are affecting how you walk, how you talk, how you work, all of that. And that
Right.
is dangerous because when you are not self-aware, when you cannot hold your own self accountable, what then happens is everybody else is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can't see what's happening. So when you compartmentalize, you have put it in a compartment in a shelf,
Mm-hmm.
but that means that oftentimes, we put stuff high. So that means you can't see that compartment.
Yeah.
So that means that when everything is happening and you're trying to figure out why everybody leaving, why everybody acting funny, because you're angry and you're
Mm-hmm.
all, but you can't see it.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I
when
just put that up on the screen.
yeah, so
Outward actions for inward emotions.
and that's exactly what it is.
Yep.
People don't see that that's
Hmm.
how it surfaces.
Right.
And so I always try to tell people, try not to, please don't do that. Because when you do that, it's harder for you to reach and it's also harder for you to see.
Mhm. Right.
Then
Absolutely.
it's hard, there's that it becomes a disconnect that you can't see what's really
Mhm.
happening.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so when things happen in your life and you're wondering why am I like this? Why is this
Hmm.
way?
Hmm.
Because you have now compartmentalized something and then you hit it. Once it's compartmentalized, oftentimes it's hidden.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
don't come out until you really dig it out. Or you say, oh, and then by then, oftentimes, it's
Mhm.
gone too far.
Yeah. Right. 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 Exactly.
Because
Yep.
I've watched people lose things, lose people,
Hmm.
lose everything because they compartmentalize when they really should have just tried their best. And I'm
To
not saying
deal
it's
with it.
easy,
Right.
but try not to put it on the shelf
Right,
because
yeah.
it's not
Definitely
helpful.
try not to put it on the shelf, even if you, talk about it. I find that when we try to process it, trying to at least hear yourself say what it is, even if you're not ready to deal with it, in some way, get it out.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier about journaling, right? Or writing. So even if you're not ready to speak the words,
Mhm.
writing the words and seeing them and saying them to yourself is just as good because it's
Yeah.
almost like that three-step process where you see it, say it, write it.
Yep.
So it's like getting that out, even if you're not ready to talk about it or address it,
Yep.
get it out of you, right?
Yep.
Rather than boxing it up and compartmentalizing it. And again, we're not talking about always about the loss of a person. Again, it could be loss of a relationship or a job. And I'm going to just speak to what I know for sure. Last week when we had our support group, there was someone there who had just that week had been let go of a job of over 20 something years. That is major, right? That is
That's
imagine for 20
yep.
plus years.
Yep.
You that is you dedicating your life every day, work day. You got
Yep.
up, you went in, you likely saw the same people, did the same thing, whatever the case may be. And then suddenly that stops. You no longer that thing is no longer there, just like a person. Your life, whatever time you got up, whatever you drank in the coffee in the morning, whatever you did, your routine, that
Yep.
stops.
Yep.
That no longer exists. That is huge. That
Yeah.
is a huge sudden loss, sudden shift, sudden change, sudden transition. So that's a process as well. That's a grief process.
Yep.
You've got to work through that.
But I think any loss where people are not under, what most people don't get, any type of loss is a shift in your identity.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
And I
Yeah.
talk about this often. I say how when you lose, it doesn't matter what type of loss it was,
Mhm.
you will never be that person before the loss,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
And so a lot of times we then try to identify, we keep trying to go back and identify with the person we were before the loss. And that's what holds a lot of us back
Yeah.
because I'm like, oh, I got to get back to who I was. You will never be that person again.
Uh-huh.
And so, just like what you said with the job, there is a loss of the identity, right? Because that person didn't know who they were
Right.
without that job because they had been on it so much. We didn't know who we were without our mothers. You didn't know who you were without that person. So at the end of the day, even without yourself, I don't know. I don't know who I am without me, without the person I thought I was, because that's a loss too. So now you now have to figure out who you are again. And that's the hardest part that I find about grief is that nobody wants to, just like when people stay in marriages because they don't want to, they might be unhappy, but they want to stay there because they don't want to start over. And grief requires you to start over. It's a requirement.
Ooh, you are dropping some nuggets. I'm telling you. So I put up there any type of shift is a loss of an identity. And then you just said what?
I said,
What?
because I don't know what y'all gonna say. It's
Lis-
no, I said, I believe that once you lose, you are required to then start over.
right there it is. I was getting ready to say I was gonna say it had something to do with starting over.
Yeah,
I'm
and
trying to
you
drop the
already
nuggets as quick as you saying them. I'm telling you, I was like, it had something to do with
know. Listen, I'm gonna have to go back and watch this
right.
because I don't remember.
Listen,
No, but honestly, you have to start over when you lose.
right.
Anytime you lose, you have to start over,
Yeah.
and that's something that as humans, women especially, we don't want to do that because
Right.
it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. It requires us to show up. It's a lot of
Yeah,
work.
it
It's a lot of
requires us
work.
to sit still. It
Sit
requires
still.
us to
Right.
process, and it requires us now to find out who we are, right?
Yep.
Because a lot of losses often make us look in the mirror and say, "Well, who am I now?"
Right. Right. Which goes back to what we said a few minutes ago about our losing our identity within, right, that job or that relationship or that person or, just life in itself. As we said before, life be life. And so, yes, it requires us to sometimes sit with it. And we don't always want to do that, right? We don't
Right.
always want to sit with things. And
Nope.
so I think that it's great that we understand, number one, again, going back to the first 30 seconds of our conversation about understanding that grief isn't always about the death of
Nope.
something, right?
Not
It's the transition.
not at
So,
all.
again, as we are wrapping up, I thank you guys for joining us live. This show will be made available after we're over and done. So that if you missed the first part of everything that we said, trust me when I tell you, this was a jam packed 30 minutes, right? I always feel like, dang, that time went by so fast when you are engaged in meaningful conversation and when you're
Yeah.
talking about something so very, very important. Again, today is Grief Awareness Day. We want to welcome you to the show. Thank you for joining us live. Even Yolanda. Hi, Yolanda. How are you? And she's inviting Ursula Garcia. Yolanda, thank you so much for joining us live. I
Beautiful.
appreciate you. Um, so the second part of what I want to say as we wrap up today's show, how can we, and remember, it ain't always about a person, although yes, grief 9 times out of 10 is associated with loss when we think about that we just suffered some type of loss of a person. But again, let's think broader about what grief is. In what ways can we recognize grief awareness today? Now, we can segment it in two different ways, right? So we can talk about how can you honor Grief Awareness Day for the loss of a person, and then how can we honor Grief Awareness Day for the loss of, let's say, a relationship or a job or something like that, right? Because there's two different ways in which you can kind of honor that. So I'm thinking for, give us one or two things that we could do today to honor someone that we lost. What is something that we could do? And it doesn't have to be a public display, but something that you can do just for yourself to just understand and know that today is Grief Awareness Day and you want to associate something that you do with it, or maybe it's to begin something. Maybe this is somebody watching and listening to this. Maybe it's them understanding and knowing that they've heard what we've said and they know that they need to process it properly and deal with it.
Yeah. So I would say one of the thing is don't hide your pain. Um, what I find so often is that we hide our pain. And I don't care if you're telling somebody I'm mad as hell that my mother not here. Because I had to say that out loud, right? It was necessary for me to say it out loud, like I'm mad as hell. Because if I didn't, then it seems like to me, um, I'm not. And then I can't properly process, right? So don't hide your pain. If you have people, tell them the truth. Tell them I'm hurting, I'm upset, and basically I don't want to deal with this, right? And also understand that number one, there is no timeline for you to grieve at all. You take the time that you need. Number two, nobody is going to grieve the same. So you do what you need to do in your process. And also, at the end of the day, your relationship with that person was different than every person who had a relationship with that person. So don't let anybody tell you how to grieve, because I find often that people don't grieve because people often tell them how to grieve. You grieve how you need to grieve. And then start your process, right? It's a hard process. Really realizing that this person is gone. But what I can tell you is that, um, just because you're starting to deal with the pain or process the grief does not take away the fact that they were here. I think for me, it took me a long time to say I can deal with this grief now, because the fact that the pain is still not there or not as intensified does not mean that my mother didn't live. And I hope that makes sense, because it took me a long time to realize that just because she wasn't here, um, doesn't mean that I had to be in pain in order to make it real that she lived and I loved her. And so I would say that for when you lost somebody, that's definitely some of the things that I would, start to work through.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said that too, because we touched again a little bit about that. And I'm keep throwing out there our support group as you see the ticker on the screen, our Good Grief support group. We meet again on September 13th at 6:30. And you can go to bit.ly Good Grief Support, or just show up on September 13th at 6:30 at 415 North Howard Street. We will welcome you with open arms. Our last meeting was amazing. So
Yes.
again, we are looking forward to the next meeting, because all of the things that we're talking about here and sharing is some of what we touched on at that meeting as well. And something you just said really resonated with me, and that is that you don't always have to feel pain to recognize the importance of that thing that you lost, right? That person or that thing. It doesn't mean that you have to, in some way, if you get to a place where you accept it and you're
Yeah.
able to talk about it without crying, doesn't mean that it hurts any less, doesn't mean that that person was any less significant, or that job was any less significant, or that relationship or whatever was any less significant, because you're able to express and talk about it in such a way without having to have a cracked voice, or to halfway start crying, or
Yeah.
whatever the case may be. So I appreciate you for sharing that as well, and really expounding upon that, because I think and then the other thing that you said as well, jumping back, is that grief doesn't have a timeline, right? So, that thing that you've lost could be gone for 5 minutes, 5 years, 5 seconds, you
Yeah.
know, it doesn't matter. It's wherever you are in the process. And even if you've gotten to that place, and then for some reason, because this has happened to me, an incident or a memory or
A
something I
smell.
smell, yeah,
Yep.
yes, something I smell, a holiday might
Yep.
take me right back to,
Right
so
there.
whatever. I lean into it. I feel what
Yep.
I feel, and I just lean into it. I've gotten to a place now where I lean into it. Seeing somebody in the grocery store who looks like my mom, or walking down the aisle or something where she knows
Yep.
me, and I'm just like, yep. So I've
Yep.
gotten to a place now where it's acceptable for me to, understand that.
Exactly. And don't be ashamed, right? Don't be
Mm-mm.
ashamed
Yeah,
about where you are in your process. Just because somebody is at one spot doesn't mean that they didn't have to go through the process. And listen, it's been over 10 years for my mother, and I still feel what I feel. And I'm
exactly.
not ashamed about it. And I'm going to
Mhm.
feel it, right?
Feel
So
it, right?
make sure
Yeah.
you have people in your space who you feel like are safe, right?
Right.
And we talked about this in our group, but you have to have safe spaces. And
Hmm.
if you don't have a safe space that's in your life, then hire one.
Yeah.
Okay, use your influence,
Absolutely.
or reach out to somebody, reach out to me, reach out. We will figure it out. But you have to have somebody that's safe, because if you don't, what happens is you're not really going to expose what needs to be exposed in order for you
That
to begin
part.
the
Yes.
process.
Yep. That part right there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that they know how to get in touch with you. So
Mhm.
I'm going to put your website there on the screen. And for
Mhm.
those of you who may be just listening in but not actually watching the show, as we also air on through the podcast. So what's on the screen is thosewithoutmothers.org. Thosewithoutmothers.org. So you can go through there and get in touch with Shamika. She is an excellent grief coach. So again, reach out, as she shared earlier, ways in which you can address and properly address and process grief is through therapy, coaching, journaling. So reach out in one of those areas, one of those aspects to help get you started. And again, like we said, I'm gonna wrap up by saying this: grief does not necessarily mean the loss of a person. Grief is a loss of a situation, a
Yeah.
relationship,
Yeah.
a person. I'm sorry, a situation, a relationship, even losing yourself.
Yeah.
We talked about that before. So definitely, if any of those apply, make sure that you reach out. Our Good Grief Support Group, September 13th at 6:30. So you can go to Good Grief Support and register, or just show up,
Just
415
show
North
up.
Howard Street.
We gonna
We'll
be there.
welcome you. Yep, we'll welcome you with open
Bring your
arms. Yes,
please. Yes. Yes.
you got
It's
to
a
start
safe
that
space.
healing in a safe space. Start
Yes.
that healing.
Yes. Yes.
Amen. Yes, yes, yes. All right. Any final parting words, Miss Shamika?
I would just say, don't feel like you gotta suffer alone.
Hmm.
Right? Those are our mothers is about mothers, but it's also about grief in general, right?
Right.
So DM me, whatever. I don't want anybody to feel like they have to go through this alone. You have the Women's Wellness Lounge to make sure you're
Absolutely.
checking not just your mental health, but your physical health. There's so many aspects to this. So just make sure you're reaching out so you don't feel like you're by yourself because you are not a burden.
No,
Don't let anybody think that your grief is a burden
no,
because it's
not at
not.
all.
It's real
Nope.
life.
Yeah. So as we titled the support group, it's good grief, right? So yeah, good
Yeah,
grief. There's
yeah,
a way in which you grieve
yeah,
properly and it becomes good grief. All
yeah.
right. Again, thank you so much for joining
Thank
me, Ms.
you.
Shamika Williams. You
Thank
guys have
you.
been here in the Women's Wellness Lounge. We look forward to our next segment that we'll have, which will be September's already here. So our next show, I believe, is in 2 weeks. So make sure that you log in, find out, get reminders. We're always here in the Women's Wellness Lounge. And you know what? Each month our topics change depending on what drives me, what moves me, and what's shaking
Yes,
out there. So again,
that's right.
womenswellnesslounge.org, mothers, thosewithoutmothers.org as well. Make sure that you are following those pages, visiting those websites, and getting more information. So you guys have a good evening, and I will talk with you soon.
Bye. Thank you.